Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. My name's Amanda.
Hey everyone, I'm Jen.
And we're here today as social workers, here to talk to you about conversations and coping, today about grief and loss. And Jen, maybe you can explain a little bit why we thought this would be a great idea to start focusing on and share a little bit about.
Yeah, so basically Amanda and I are both therapists in private practice, and we both moved our practices online. And we felt like just in a casual conversation with one another that there were some really common themes that were coming up that our clients were bringing up. I know that since I've moved my practice online, I've been seeing a much wider range of clients just in terms of demographics, location. Like I'm seeing clients from rural areas all over Canada, not just in my little bubble on the Danforth where I usually practice. And in our practice, I think we realized that there are some common themes, and that a lot of people that we're talking to don't necessarily conceptualize what they're going through in the context of grief and loss. So I'm not sure if that's your experience.
Yeah, it's definitely been a bit of that. And I think right now what we're going through, April 2020 is COVID-19, right? And that we're doing this in this kind of like remote way because we can't be in the same room as colleagues, as social workers, and our therapy is, again, gone remote. And with that, there's a lot of folks coming to me and you, of course, talking about how this is a time of struggle and stress and feeling let down about a lot of things, and that hasn't really been labeled as a sense of loss or grief for them, right? And so I think that that's why we thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about that and kind of maybe come to some sort of conclusion as to what folks can do about that.
Right, and I think that's important just in terms of why we're doing this, because we hope that we can come up with some ideas, we can brainstorm together on ways that people can cope. So the way that we understand a problem, of course, filters into the way that we respond to it. What our formulation is will ultimately lead into the things that we can do to make ourselves feel better. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and with that, right, how a lot of when people struggle is based a lot on what we think about the situation, right? And this time has really shifted the way we normally interact in our daily lives, right? So we might see certain things in clients and even ourselves as a way we take care of ourselves and cope with just some of the tougher parts in life. And this global pandemic has shifted that for a lot of people, including I think the both of us, is how we take care of ourselves, right? And because that coping is no longer maybe as accessible or similar to what we're used to, folks have been a lot more open to the experience of hardship, and it's hitting them in different ways that it might not have before. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what is grief. Maybe you can say a little bit about that from your perspective.
Right. So when we think of grief, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the death of somebody, mourning the death of somebody close to us.
Mm-hmm.
But here we're conceptualizing grief as something that is an emotional reaction to the loss of something. And I think right now we can agree that we're all going through a loss of normalcy. So there's a wide spectrum of loss right now, whether you or somebody you know is struggling, medically, all the way to not just being able to go about your day-to-day routine. So maybe, we can talk a little bit about what are the coping mechanisms that people usually use that are now taken away? Like, what do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. I know even just for myself, a little self-disclosure here, my, yoga studio closed. And I thought it was just something that I did, on a weekend or after work. And it wasn't. Not being able to not only move in the same location, in the same studio, but to not see the faces of those that I'm used to seeing has been kind of hard, So for in one way, that's something that's shifted for me. I don't know for you if you've experienced a shift.
Yeah, even like I work from home otherwise, and I rent an office to do sessions, but even just going to a coffee shop, like being able to interact with somebody in the morning, grab a coffee, go for a walk. And these are all things that we don't necessarily conceptualize as coping. They're all things that we just take for granted, that we just do day to day, but that really are mechanisms that we use to help regulate our emotions. And now that those are gone, some things can be stirred up in us um, that can be difficult.
For sure. And, you know, when we talk about it in a way of coping is really just things that we do to help sometimes feel either better and maintain our health and mental health. And sometimes they're things we do to help distract and deal with some of the harder parts of life, right? And just because we're in a global pandemic right now doesn't necessarily mean that those things that were originally bothersome have shifted, right? A lot of these things are still happening. Life goes on, right? And unfortunately, life has shifted in a way where some of those copings are different. So we'll definitely talk about that and what we can do going forward. But it is to say that things are different and that the grief experience is normal, right? That the grief reaction to this is quite normal, and that of course we're going to be experiencing, you know, a little bit of discomfort and stress and sense of loss around things because we don't have the typical ways of coping to help deal with those things to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm. One thing that you said that stands out to me is how this kind of like magnifies things that people were experiencing before.
Mm-hmm.
So before this all started, let's say you're dealing with something hard in a relationship or at work,
Right.
something hard at school, but that coping, that distraction is, well, life goes on. We have to get through this routine. And now that that's taken away, there seems to be almost like this magnification of challenges where things that were hard before are a lot harder now.
Definitely. A lot of folks are coming to me, you know, about one thing or another. They've come to me for a specific reason, and the implications of the virus have exacerbated what they're feeling because, again, the normal ways of coping have shifted.
Mm-hmm.
So this can definitely be a time of magnetization for sure. And that, you know, things might get stirred up, right? Different ways of even the way we think about ourselves and talk about ourselves might be reactivated or re-triggered. So that's also important for folks to note as well. And that there's ultimately, and this maybe leads us into the next space and subject, that there's different ways to express loss, right? And that it might not look the same for everybody.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of, you know, what I hope to drive the most in our conversation about how grief and loss isn't expressed. Because when you think of grief, what kind of emotion do you think of? Like
Sad,
crying.
Right.
But grief, we can think of other ways that it's expressed. So, like denial, the inability to incorporate this new reality into, you know, into our daily lives. That bargaining piece. So I'm thinking right now of, you know, Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief.
Yes.
In terms of when we experience a loss, we go through these 5 stages. And now we know it's not linear. It's not like you make your way through it and everything is fine. You can feel one way and experience progress and then revert back. But there's like denial, like I'm not engaging in things being different. There's anger, and anger is something that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being attached to grief. That externalizing energy. So if you have a partner or a child or a parent who's being, you know, snippy or short, that can be an expression of grief as well. And it's harder to get support when you're being, you know, snippy or mean. But you don't know how to ask for it.
Exactly. And that, you know, when we move forward and talk about that and ways to cope with this, one of those things is engaging with that vulnerability and saying, hey, I'm actually not okay right now. And this kind of sucks for me. And acknowledging that anger might be an expression of that grief, of that sense of loss. Right. And I love that you brought up the stages of grief because it's one way to think of the experience of grief that is, like you said, non-linear, right? So if I experience grief about something, you might be at a different point, right, in those stages, and that one is not better than the other, right? And that they're also transient. One day I might be more easily accepting of, being stuck at home. Notice the word stuck, right? Or more feeling more comfort in being at home. But other days it might feel like stuck, and I might feel frustrated with that, and maybe even angry, or denial with how long we might be in this situation at home, right? So it's okay, I think, to say if we move through those and go back and forth and experience shades of each one even.
And it's almost like arbitrary, like you don't get to pick how you wake up feeling. So I don't know if it's been your experience, but some days you wake up and you have this like Zen quality of, I can only control what I can, and I'm gonna have a nice leisurely breakfast, get to my work. And some days you just wake up feeling like prickly, or you wake up feeling sad. And it's almost like that awareness that these feelings come and go without you getting to pick what comes up.
Absolutely. And I think that that's so important for people to know, right? Because it can be kind of shaming and guilt-inducing to be not so in control of what we're feeling. And that's the piece around grief, is that it can just appear. And because it's a normal reaction, we're really trying to talk today about the fact that it is normal means that it's okay to be in a process of bargaining, and that it's okay to be in a process of acceptance, or it's okay to be in a process of anger, or just completely denying what's going on. They're all protective and they're all purposeful, right? So this makes me think a lot about not only the stages of grief, but the different types of grief, which might be important to talk about now. And I was introduced to this idea from a trainer that I had learned from. His name is Doug Smith, incredible guy, works a lot in the States, lots of experience, lots of personal grief that he shares in his trainings. And what stood out to me were specifically the types of grief, because, to make things more complicated or simplify it, really, to have categories of, okay, I'm feeling this or this or this. He discussed 4 distinct variations of loss and grief. So, we can kind of go through those, but the first one is vicarious grief. So maybe some of you have heard the word or term vicarious trauma, right? Experiencing a trauma or, a difficult experience just as someone is relating it to you and talking to you about it. It's not happening to you. So that's kind of the same thing with vicarious grief, right? For example, when this started early on, I don't know when you heard about it, Jen, but there was a lot of discussion around other countries, right? And, for example, China and Wuhan, and, how it moved to different countries like Iran and Italy, now New York City, where things are fairly intense, right? And we hear these things about our global community and generally feel empathetic for folks, right? And it's not happening to us. And we know, at the time when this first started, COVID-19, we were safe, right? This wasn't impacting our community, but there was a sense of, wow, this is really scary for people, and people are dying en masse, right? So that is definitely early on, I think, one of the big things that a lot of us were experiencing in terms of vicarious grief.
Right. That really stands out to me, just in terms of turning on the TV and hearing the stories that are happening right now at the long-term care homes. One of the podcasts that I listened to every day before this happened was the New York Times podcast, The Daily. And I've elected not to listen to today's episode, or at least make sure I'm in a really good space or have some coping lined up after, because it's profiling a Brooklyn hospital where things are really tough right now. And even just that experience of we have mirror neurons. So let's say right now I'm smiling really big. Smile too. It's just the way that our brains are wired, that when I feel sad, you start to feel maybe not sadness, but certainly discomfort. Something gets stirred up in you. So we are wired for connection. We're wired for, being able to feel other people's emotions. So that vicarious grief and that vicarious experience of I can actually become like very negatively impacted by hearing other people's stories. And that's not to say, we shouldn't be aware of what's going on in the world, but just to point out that the news is very singularly focused on the negative, on that like sensationalism of look at what's happening. There's such huge stories, but there's all this other stuff too happening here and here and here and here that we're not necessarily, paying attention to. And when we get inundated with sadness and grief, crying, that can have a toll on us. And I think it's important to note that it has a toll on us whether we notice it or not. So if you feel yourself feeling sick, if you feel somatic symptoms, jaw pain, neck pain, right? Like that can be because your body's reacting without you becoming aware. You hear these stories and you notice the creeping or the tightness, the tension.
Absolutely. And I think that points a lot to how protective our bodies are of us, right? And that, even if we're not paying attention, or if we feel that we're actually taking information in, our bodies are made in a way that is to protect us, to notice things that are happening in the world, in our general environment, right? And so that response isn't necessarily a bad thing either. It's just one of those things that your body is trying to say, like, hey, this is going on. We just have to practice kind of easing into it and learning what our body is trying to say, whether it be in thought form, like, oh, this is uncomfortable, I don't like it. Emotional form, wow, this makes me sad, or, have just really low mood, or another thing, or somatically, so physically, right? All types of clues that can help inform us then what to do next, right?
Right. Yes. So we have vicarious grief. What's the second type of grief?
Yeah, so second type of grief would be anticipatory grief, which is a really big one, I think, for a lot of people. Really just having a sense of loss for things that we've anticipated would happen, right? And that can look like a lot of different things. And we can give like 3 examples, but ultimately it's whatever you as a viewer were hoping for. And that could be big things like, big celebrations like a wedding, right? Not being able to celebrate in that same way, or a graduation or a milestone birthday, right? To things as small as like, wow, we're really looking forward to summer. And, really looking forward to being outside a little more and noticing the trees and the flowers, and not maybe having that experience in the same way. So yeah, maybe you can think of a few examples on your end as well.
Yeah, I think like we've been cooped up all winter and we're excited to get outside, and like spring is kind of that rebirth and like reconnecting. There's that like inaugural spring barbecue that has now been taken away, and all these things that we're not sure whether they're very unlikely to happen, and not bringing awareness to how these things again were coping for us and how they've been taken away. Can be harmful. Like it's okay to be sad for things that we never had. And this can also magnify sadness of things like, just like we had talked about, that this can exacerbate feelings that we had already had before this started. This can kind of shine a spotlight on things that you're missing. Like if you have a partner that's long distance, or even a partner that doesn't live with you and you see them, or anything that you're looking forward to has been altered.
Absolutely. And that sort of leads us into the next type of grief, because with anticipatory grief, it's very personal, right? I think that's what we're saying here, is that it's personal to the individual, what they personally, what you listener are kind of looking forward to, and that might not happen because of the current global situation in our community. And oftentimes, because it's so individualistic and personalized, other people might not entirely understand that you feel lost for that thing, right? And that it might kind of like blow you off and say, well, don't, that's ridiculous. You don't have to feel bad about that. Like, you can just do that next time, or, you know, it's fine, just do this, and provide alternatives. And perhaps that's coming from a very good place, right? For those people. At the same time, what that ends up doing is very invalidating for the person experiencing that sense of loss. So there's actually a term for this. It's called disenfranchised grief. So grief that is unacknowledged or denied or devalued, right? And I've seen this a lot with clients that come to me, and they almost do it to themselves in some way, where they're invalidating their own grief. Saying they shouldn't be worried about things, that they shouldn't be sad about certain things, that other people have it worse. I'm not sure if you've heard that as well, but it's sort of like, well, at least we still get to have groceries, and Italy, they can't do X, Y, and Z, or, China, they couldn't do X, Y, and Z, or at least our death rates are lower, but they're still sad.
Oh, I think this is probably the one that stands out the most to me, is that grief that isn't validated, and how dysregulating that can be for the nervous system.
So bad.
For example, if I'm talking to a client, I'll get them to rate their level of distress for a certain thing that they can think of that makes them upset. So for example, if they were really looking forward to an event, and I've had clients say, like, when I think about this, I think it should be a 1 out of 10, 1 meaning, very low distress. And I say, like, well, what is your gut telling you? Because again, you don't get to choose how distressed you are. Distress is a physiological reaction that you don't get to necessarily take your pick on, how upset I want to be about this thing. So when clients do really reflect on how upset they are about something, it can be higher, like a 3 or a 4 or a 5. And often, like, they use that word should, like, I shouldn't be upset about this. I shouldn't be upset because I have a roof over my head and we have enough income to make it for the next few months. So I don't have it as bad as people who necessarily are in more trouble than we are, for example. At the same time, that really dysregulates the nervous system, because now I have 2 problems. I have the problem of actually feeling distress. My heart rate goes up, blood pressure increases, sweaty palms, tightness in the jaw, trouble with the stomach. And then my second problem is now I feel stupid for thinking that way. So,
right. There's the judgment piece, on top of already feeling sadness and grief and loss, there's the judgment. And so maybe you can speak a little bit to how you help clients make sense of that, right? Where you're feeling maybe grateful that, like, wow, I'm really glad I'm financially able, for example, to be okay in this situation. But also I'm feeling really sad, or another emotion about it. Like, how do you kind of walk through clients with that and help them understand that piece?
Yeah. I think people get quite dysregulated when they feel like they have to pick. Is it I'm grateful that I have this situation, or is it that I'm upset at an aspect of my situation? And I almost can't rest till I get to the bottom of the truth. But there are certain therapies that actually consider this process of dialectics, that these 2 truths can be held at the same time, and our nervous system can relax when we don't actually have to pick. When we don't have to say, okay, am I happy or am I sad? Can I hold both of those at the same time?
Yeah. How refreshing is that, right? To be able to allow space for 2 realities, in that, it's not that a person has to be one way, and that if they're not that one way, even a little bit, that somehow that's wrong or bad, or that they're not doing the best that they can, or that they're not appreciative of what they do have. So I think that can be fairly freeing for a lot of people, to not have to choose.
It's
right?
okay. Yeah. And a lot of people that I've been talking to have also felt a certain level of guilt for feeling the way that they do, in terms
Right.
of, let's say you're experiencing joy. It's okay to experience joy during difficult times. That doesn't mean that you're 100% happy, because there's a lot of suffering happening, but it's okay to sometimes, experience and fully sink into joy, even when the context is difficult.
Exactly. And that kind of brings to mind, even though we're talking about grief and loss, if you're watching this and you're actually not feeling that way, that's okay. Or that if you're really resonating with this, but your partner or your children or your best friend is feeling differently, that's okay too, right? And that neurologically we can respond differently to the same scenario, right? And that's dependent on so many factors. Who's kind of like around, do we have social supports, are we, what are we waking up with that day, what's our personal history, what's our genetics, our temperament, so all this to say that it is okay if you feel differently than what we're saying, and then also feel if other people who feel differently as well. So maybe that brings us into the last type of grief, which is ambiguous. Maybe if you can say a little bit about that piece. Ambiguous.
Ambiguous, by definition, means you don't necessarily know what to attach it to. It's just something that exists. And if we think about this like collective consciousness and this collective, yes, there's hope, and at the same time there's the real collective sadness, and that is going to affect us.
Absolutely. Exactly. You hit the nail on the head in that maybe it's unidentified completely, right? Maybe we're okay. Maybe we feel stable. Maybe we're not too attached to a certain outcome, or we didn't feel this sense of loss, or we weren't hoping for this big thing to happen, in the coming months. But there's just this like general icky sense of malaise, right? So, and it's unlabeled, right? We don't know what it is from specifically, but given the news, given, maybe the people we live with are experiencing, on the stages of grief, let's say anger, they're a little more prickly or electric, right? It can be a lot on the system, and we might not have words for it in those moments, but it could be this sort of like ambiguous catch-all grief and loss and just this blah feeling, which can be hard, right? Because we don't have anything to attach it to. So I think sometimes that can be one of the hardest as well, when it's unidentified.
And it's also like I haven't really been noticing like genuine conversations in terms of how people are struggling. Like I've seen more on the people really producing a lot of content, people moving their businesses online. Like it's much less common that people will come out and say, hey, I'm really struggling right now. And I don't know whether that's been your experience, but that's certainly been contributing to, some of my clients look around and say, everyone's being more productive. But no one who's being productive is going to necessarily come out and say, yeah, I'm being productive, but I actually was really struggling before I did this. So we're kind of putting our best foot forward, where we're more inclined to do that than to share our vulnerabilities. And that can have an impact on that feeling of shame for if you're not doing well.
Yeah, exactly. And if we rewind a little bit, right, and we think about the context of our coping right now, right? We talked about how coping might look different, might even be a little bit less than what we're used to be doing, just given the nature of the situation. And if we're not coping as much as a community as a whole, then part of coping, because we are resilient beings as humans, is to find other ways of coping, right? And for some people, that is deep diving themselves into projects and different forms of like work and being creative in those ways.
Right.
And so that distraction can be good and helpful, right? And at the same time, sometimes makes it a little bit tricky to acknowledge what it is that we're actually feeling, right? So it's sort of that balance between, okay, am I feeling am I feeling a certain way? Am I grieving about this thing? Do I feel a sense of loss? And I'm just sort of like squashing it and bottling it up? Or is it that truly, you know what, this sucks, yes, but I feel okay. And I'm able to recognize that I feel okay. So maybe the common theme there is acknowledging where you're at, you know, and being present with yourself, which kind of takes us a little bit to now what, right? Like now what do we do? We identified that we're grieving, or we identified that we feel just this general sense of loss. Okay, now what? And so one of those things, and you've put it beautifully, is to acknowledge it. And part of that is quite vulnerable and hard for folks, I think, right? I don't know if you've seen that, but you're kind of talking about people moving ahead and finding things to do and not really identifying with the sense of, I'm struggling.
It's hard to necessarily identify that you're struggling if you, let's say you are still working right now. You have your job that's moved online and you have to perform all day.
Right.
You know, coping exists on a continuum, and it can be, for some people, it might be increased alcohol use or increased cannabis use. For some people, it can be that experience of fighting, because if I'm fighting, I don't have to look inside. For some people, it can be working, just like you said. If I'm working all day, and then at night I go and shut my laptop off, and then I'm finding I'm struggling to fall asleep. So it is important to check in and see how you're doing. And we don't shame any type of coping. Like, we work from a harm reduction model to say, stay safe, but do what you have to do. There's no shame in what you're doing to shift between these states. If I'm upset, what do I do to make myself feel better? Some things are better for us than others, but we do what we can, and there's no shame in that at all. I'm talking to clients right now who are, experiencing panic attacks and are using more medication for that. And that's okay. We're on a call then talking about there's risks and benefits to medication. So can we weigh the risks against the benefits and move towards maybe starting to build natural ways of coping, if that's what's helpful. It really is no shame about ways that people are coping. That I find is quite freeing for people to understand.
Absolutely. And especially if we can almost use it as a barometer of how we're feeling, right? That coping might be able to help us identify what it is and the degree to which we are feeling a certain thing, right? Because it's when we are able to acknowledge and say, wow, look at all the coping I'm doing. Okay, that means this is really intense for me, right? I'm actually actively having to go about do things differently, whether that's using more substances, for example, or, sleeping a lot, or snacking a lot, right? That lots of people find themselves in right now. They're at home, we're at home, usually our bed is nearby or the couch is nearby, and, we can kind of escape into Netflix forever and ever, right? And so I think that Jen, you make an incredibly important point in that coping right now is sort of all we can do, or one of the main things we can do, and that there's absolutely no shame in what that coping is, as long as it works for us, but that, obviously that it's keeping us safe and healthy in the long run. So, and in terms of acknowledging, because we can't really do much about it until we acknowledge, there are two ways we can go about acknowledging. And one of those ways is more of like a cognitive perspective, or, thoughts, put simply. So acknowledging some thoughts that we're having around grief, like, this sucks. I wish that things were different. I had hoped that it would be this way, right? Versus somatically, or what your body is saying and doing. We talked about stomach aches, or, headaches, or neck tension, or jaw tension, right? These can all be signifiers of your body trying to communicate with you to say, like, hey, I'm not okay. And that when that happens, that's actually a good thing, because it's your body being in line with you and really trying to send the message of, I need loving care, right? Like, come help me.
I could scream this from the rooftops. Like your body is trying to tell you something. Are you going to listen to what it's trying to tell you? And are you going to meet what it's trying to tell you with care?
Absolutely. And that's I think the main piece, right? With care, because it's so easy to go into judgment, right? Like, I see a lot of people who have a lot of back tension or neck tension or jaw tension. And every time it comes up, they'll sort of go into this dialogue of, this always happens. This is so annoying. This is the worst thing ever. I'm so tired of it. And really all it's doing is ramping the system up, right? It's more anger and frustration and energy that's going towards really your body trying to help you out. Of course, it's not comfortable, right? No one loves having back pain or jaw pain. But in a way, if we start to look at things differently and shift our perspective on, this is just pain for the sake of pain versus, oh no, this is just a communication from my body saying that maybe like go easy, or I need more rest, or hey, I'm stressed out. Remember to breathe, right? But these are the different ways we can start to communicate with our body and actually respond to it compassionately.
And also how our knee-jerk reaction is to do everything but do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So do I want to do a 10-minute meditation, which I think everyone has time for right now, or do I want to go scrolling online and just go down this black hole of opening 20 tabs?
Yeah.
Right? Because it doesn't feel good to be in our bodies sometimes. So I don't want to spend time there. My jaw hurts. I don't want to spend time there.
It's true, especially for folks who have had a trauma history, right? Where the body isn't a safe place, where it's not a place that is comfortable or even familiar, right? I have a lot of clients that I ask, what's going in your body right now? What are you feeling? And it is so hard that it's almost numb. And if that is something that you are feeling, that's okay too. That for some reason your body has shifted to numbness for some sort of protection, right? I always come from the perspective of your body is literally doing the best it can for you right now, whether that be completely numbing out or whether that be pain or discomfort or tingly or cold, or, it's always trying to help you reach this state of homeostasis, of balance, right? So your body's not against you, even though it sometimes can feel that way. But I love that you mentioned that it's not our knee-jerk reaction to do that. Like, I'd much rather eat a bag of Twizzlers than to like a 10-minute meditation. It's harder.
Yeah. And that's why sometimes it's helpful to seek out some support. So if you seek out some support, you have an hour that's dedicated to slowing down and to stopping this cognitive reel of all the ways that I'm trying to keep myself safe by just spinning and going and going and going, and really taking the time with support, with facilitation, to slow down, tune in, check in.
Exactly. Particularly too, when we seek out support, we have not only our own nervous system, but we have two in the room. So, your own that potentially could be dysregulated and uncomfortable. Let's assume that experience is a bit of grief, given our talk. The other nervous system in the room is meant in a therapy setting to be there for you, right? To scaffold you as you're feeling uncomfortable. So you don't have to rely just on your body and your own system. You're relying on two. Which is why reaching out for support can be so effective, because you're not isolated, you're not alone.
Yeah. And also understanding that the system is impacted, that system that processes stressors is significantly impacted by historical experiences. So right now, what this is bringing up for people is a lot of old feelings of feelings. Right now, think about how many people are struggling with their value. I'm seeing a lot more males in my practice right now whose jobs have shifted and who, aren't necessarily showing up in the world in the way that they believe gives them value. So who am I in this world if I'm not earning the same that I was before? Where do I belong? How do I stay connected? We live to move towards happiness and connection, but right now, I don't know, is it through a Zoom call? If I'm in a Zoom call and I don't feel connected, what's wrong with me? I don't have any control over what's happening. When has that come up historically? Of feeling like you're out of control? And how is that impacting your ability to now process this loss of control right now? The belief that you can handle it, right? I've had people say like, I can't handle what's going on right now. So all these things, past is present. So seeking out support can help to go in the past and, look at some of these experiences that have shaped the nervous system. It's almost like the stressor right now of COVID is moving through everyone's individual processing system and then is reacting with everyone's individual stress response. And with grief, we're saying that's anger, denial, bargaining, trying to figure out this new way of being, sadness, detachment. So it's really helpful to bring this processing system and its uniqueness into awareness to start to, look at how to move it towards processing in maybe a more adaptive way.
Absolutely, more adaptive. And I appreciate you saying that, because I think the body naturally, and the mind really, because they are one, has the tendency to adapt, right? And to be very much survival focused, right? And that our coping, regardless of what that looks like, is adaptive. And perhaps some coping is more helpful and healthy than others, right? And that's, I guess, what we're talking about too. And that, okay, how do we move towards a little bit more ease, a coping that feels easier on the body, easier on the system, and that ultimately works? Because that's, right, I think, what we want is we want to feel better, or at least feel easier, feel like it's easier to have that experience of COVID-19 and the stress response move through us easier. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that, like how folks can, what they can do at home. We talked about of therapy and reaching out and relying on an alternate nervous system to help, but kind of what they can do at home, what we can do even for ourselves at home to help process these feelings of grief and loss. So far we've talked about acknowledging it, right? Cognitively, somatically, in our minds, in our bodies. Acknowledge what we're feeling. And secondly, that takes us to labeling your feelings. I know that's very helpful in terms of the nervous system. I had a conversation with a client today where we talked about how small that feels, just labeling. And really what that looks like is, I'm really having a hard time. And I think that feels like anger. I'm just really pissed off about it. And she had challenged me a little bit on it to say, well, what good is that? Labeling what I'm feeling. And I said, well, it's the difference between you saying to me, Amanda, I'm really struggling, this really feels like anger. And me saying, no, you're happy. And you going, no, I'm angry. And me going, no, you're happy. And how dysregulating that is. And she was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And we do that to ourselves, right? Like you, me, and the next person, one of the coping strategies is to move forward, is to deny almost what it is that we're going through, to belittle it, talk about disenfranchised grief. The power of labeling really helps acknowledge that this is what I'm experiencing, as opposed to, no, I'm fine. We're so used to, saying, I'm fine, and I have to continue to be fine for not only me, but my family, for my dog, for my job, for my kids, for my partner, and whatever else. So I don't know if you have more to say about that, but the labeling of feelings can be quite effective, even though it can feel so tiny.
It's like painfully simple. It can seem that way. And at the same time, we need to sit down and have an hour booked, or, even just 5 minutes. It's hard to book 5 minutes to do this. But when we label what emotions we're feeling, first of all, we need to become aware with what sensations are coming up in the body. And that amalgamation of sensations, everything, leads to a labeling of emotion. Once we label that emotion, we now know, what do I do with this? Beautiful. We've identified anger. So I have anger here. You don't just let it sit. You have to do something. So how do you move anger through you? So is it a movement practice? Is it, maybe tidying up and moving this energy? So we consider it as then a skillful response to what we then do with it. You're angry, great. What do you do to get your anger out? You want to yell? Perfect. Do you want to be mad at me? Great. Let's talk. Do it and see how you feel after. Just check in. So labeling it and bringing that left brain, that logical, linear, linguistic brain to that emotional brain, we know right away the nervous system calms down. If I can recognize I'm sad, okay, I'm sad, yep. And my body calms down because I feel seen by myself. I'm in a relationship with myself. It's going really well.
So glad to hear. And, as you said that, I almost felt that calming, right? As soon as there's a recognition of even someone else being a little bit more in line potentially with what they're feeling, like the mirror neurons just fly off the handle, right? And just like anxiety and grief and fear is contagious, so is calm and this sense of being relaxed or at ease, right? It's contagious. And so, don't wait for the people in your house to arrive at that, right? You can be the change agent there for yourself, and have a little bit more control in a time where control is very limited sometimes, right? We don't, we're controlled about how we can congregate outside, right? Or whether or not we're able to go to work, or, waiting in line at the grocery store, like so much control. So this small aspect of control can really help just calm that right down for sure.
We always have options, even though we have it, like our life has been fundamentally altered. We always have options in the way that we respond, the way that we frame things. When we recognize a feeling, what we do with that. So we have options for ourselves, but it's also really important to not take responsibility for the people in your life's feelings right now. Because think about those stages of grief. So if I'm feeling really accepting today, I woke up feeling very centered, but let's say if you have a partner who's feeling angry that day, right? We can really want to come in and save and take responsibility. We can just acknowledge that that person's living their truth that day, and ours is, we might wake up the next day feeling angry ourselves. So really acknowledging I can only control what I can, and I'm not responsible for how other people necessarily are feeling, which can be really hard when it has to do with partners, parents, kids. Like, we can do our best to support our loved ones, but ultimately when we take care of ourselves, we change how we interact in that system, and things do tend to get better. If calm is contagious, the best thing parents can do for their young people is to take care of themselves right now.
Absolutely. I've had so many conversations about this with parents where, their world and the child's world, child being, either a 4-year-old or a 17-year-old, has been turned upside down, right? So much lack of consistency, lack of scheduling. It's really difficult, I think, for parents right now in knowing what to do with their children and feeling guilt a lot of the time over, oh my gosh, am I, structuring their time enough? Are other kids going to get ahead? What's next year going to be like? Are they going to fall behind? And how do I juggle that with all the pressures I'm experiencing as an individual being, right? That I am not just, like a mother or a father or, a caregiver for this young person. And that from what you're saying, it's sort of like when we're on an airplane, right? And there's that emergency response of putting that mask on us before young people even, right? It's true that we can have the best impact on others when we feel at full capacity or fuller capacity, which goes against, I think, what a lot of people are taught, and what might come naturally to a lot of people, which is to help, which is to reach out. and really, again, can't drive it home enough that this is about you and your importance to be self-sustaining and okay. So I'm glad you touched on that. We've been talking a lot about emotions, right? And I think that as therapists, we're sometimes in our little emotional bubbles of, that it's really easy for us to label emotions and to know emotions and to know what they feel like in our own bodies. Sometimes in the bodies of our clients, we can see the physical reaction as they're sitting there. Meanwhile, they might be like, I'm fine. So we become quite easily attuned and aware of the other end of the self because it's our job. Now, for a lot of different people, emotions also might come very naturally, right? And that can be based on how we were raised, the roles that we were taught to play in society, whether it's okay to express or emote in different ways. So for those people, emotional types of processing with grief might be very helpful, right? So talking to a friend about their situation or their feelings, kind of like we're doing now, reaching out and being in community with people, right? Mm-hmm. And acknowledging one another. Journaling, a lot of my clients journal or use types of journals that have prompts, that help you kind of process and write. And then, then there's just like downright crying, like, this sucks, I feel overwhelmed, I feel sad, tears. Mm-hmm. And then for others, other people I've worked with, instrumental processing is very important and a lot easier. And what I mean by instrumental processing, because I know you're just dying to ask, is really is attaching processing to doing. So not so blatantly emotionally focused, but sometimes it can be fairly unrelated or related. So for example, in the training by Doug Smith, who I mentioned earlier with the types of grief, he had a story about a person in his life who had lost someone very important, and they just chopped wood for like the next few weeks after that person had died. So for that sense of grief and loss, it was a death. And so that person ended up chopping wood, which had nothing to do with the death itself. The person who died didn't necessarily have an affinity for forests or nature or wood. But the ability to, and kind of like you were saying, Jen, about, anger and, okay, what are you going to do about it, right? Processing through an act can be so helpful for the system itself. If emotional processing, like talking about it, isn't as natural, for example. And there's lots of examples with that, right? So, for folks who had trips planned, right? And trips can mean a lot for people, not just vacation, but a break, an escape from the world as we know it. Also learning and, diving into different cultures and things like that. An action that can be tied to that might be, scrapbooking, or, okay, planning for what a trip would look like in a few months from now or a year from now. Really taking a little bit of that control back, a little bit of that aspect of, okay, I can do a thing, kind of like you said, we always have options. There's always things that we're able to do to be able to move forward and process. And processing might not look the same for everyone, which is, I think, what I'm getting at here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like it's yard work season or planting season. I see you have your plants behind you. But can we conceptualize that as coping and of managing grief, and that instrumental ways are also ways of moving grief and loss through us? And emotional ways, do you have a friend or a partner or a parent or somebody that you can call to say, hey, I'm actually not doing very well today, and I just need you to tell me that I'm okay?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The reaching out, the connecting, the expression of vulnerability, right? In that, I am not okay. And in that, it actually invites the other person and gives them that freedom to say, I'm not doing okay as well. And then we can join in this, ease of, okay, this is normal, right? This is normal to feel this way. It's okay that we're feeling this way, and look at us thrive, that we're still here, we're still alive, we're still taking steps to just manage this as best as we can. And really knowing, I think, zooming out a little bit, what's good for you, right? And you might not be a person that completely slots right into emotional processing, right? And you might not be the type of person that completely slots into instrumental or task-oriented processing. And really, you can, if you can and feel comfortable, to use either of those at your discretion and to your advantage, right? Some days it might feel easier to just go for a run, if while you're watching this, we still can, go outside and go for runs, to do so and to make it this physical experience, or to call a friend and be like, you know what, I feel really crappy today. This kind of sucks. How are you? And if that feels hard, even just starting with calling a friend, period, and checking in on them, which also gives the opportunity for community and engaging in relationship, even if talking about feelings isn't easy or natural in that very relationship.
Yeah, I think from an attachment standpoint, of course, both of us have, that's our framework that we work under: attachment, understanding that relationships and connections are what make the unbearable bearable. Mm-hmm. So right now, finding some sort of genuine connection with friends or family members can make this problem that is actually quite large seem more manageable. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's that contagion, again, ironically, that we can experience, a sense of like settledness within ourselves when we can rely and use, not in a manipulative way, of course, but someone else's state, and someone else's just being seen by someone else, and I have to say, Jen, even doing this, right? Like talking to each other, and we're in our own spaces and places, right? We're not very close right now. And while I would love to be, we're not. And that's just the reality of the situation, right? And so it's like, how can people, including ourselves, engage in ways that feel good and that fill our cup, and that even if, it feels really granular and small, eventually those like grains of sand can actually string together. It ends up being weighted, right? And I have to remind my clients that a lot, because it's our natural tendency to sort of devalue or think that things won't be helpful. But enough of very small, helpful things does add up, for sure.
Right. So I'm sure we could go on forever and ever. So I wonder about perhaps summing up, again, why it's important to have recognized the different types of grief, and then just doing a quick bullet point about ways to cope. And yeah, maybe we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So again, going over the different types of grief, that they're all normal, they're all okay, and labeling that what you're experiencing can be, that it can be grief, and how that can be quite freeing. I know that that's been freeing for the clients we work with, for us personally, normalizing that lots of people are feeling things that they're not talking about publicly right now, normalizing that, it's not crazy to be having a panic attack in this situation.
Just so that it's not crazy to be fine, and experience joy, and talking about the different types of grief, right? So we discussed today vicarious grief, right? Grieving for others that we might not know, anticipatory grief, feeling grief and loss, sense of loss for things that have yet to happen, will not happen, or have never happened. Disenfranchised grief, that sense of, things aren't being acknowledged, or maybe they've actually been devalued by people in your life. To say, don't grieve those things, it's not a big deal. Actually, if that's what you're feeling, then it's really okay. Which, Jen had talked a lot about this concept of dialectics, meaning that you know, there can be two things going on, that on the one hand, I can be grateful or have one emotion going on. And then on the flip side, have an entirely opposite emotional experience going on. And the two don't have to compete, and they don't negate each other at all. And then lastly, ambiguous grief. So this unidentified general malaise, sense of unease, and that it's okay to not be identified what it is. It can just kind of be and be recognized as grief as well. Which brings us into what to do about it and some of the things we've covered.
So what to do about it, recognizing sensations in the body, so really low level stuff. We're not saying up here, we're literally saying my stomach feels tight. Okay, I can relax that a little bit. Or what does that mean? Oh, I'm feeling anxious. So noticing somatic, you know, experiences of different emotions, labeling the emotions, either processing emotionally, so reaching out for help from friends, family, journaling, crying, kind of that more emotional experience, or moving to instrumental ways of coping through exercise or working on the house or apartment, you know, completing a project, cleaning out your fridge, like how we make implicit ways of coping explicit, and seeking support, because this is hard.
This is so hard, so hard. And, you know, circling back to how normal that is. And it's okay. It's okay to say it. And in saying it and coming from a vulnerable place, that vulnerability of, you know, I'm not perfect and I am struggling, even in a world where a lot of people, especially on social media and stuff like that, are putting their kind of best foot forward, that it's can be scary to say that we're not okay, but that it is okay to not be. And in doing so, we can actually access more support because we're putting it out there in the world.
Okay, Amanda, it was lovely to chat with you. I think this is so helpful for me to even review and go over, and I hope that it was helpful for you, and we hope that it's helpful to those that are listening. You're absolutely not alone. There's really common experiences that lots of people are going through right now. Whatever you're feeling is okay, and we wish you all the best.
Thanks, Jen.
All right, bye.